Other pieces of news, I should say, that are making headlines in the US. Republican Senator Mitch McConnell has announced that he will step down as party leader in November. The Kentucky senator, who turned 82 last week, will leave as the longest-serving Senate leader in history. The minority leader says that he plans to hold on to his seat in the chamber, his current term ending in 2027.
One of life's most underappreciated talents is to know when it's time to move on to life's next chapter. Still have enough gas in my tank to thoroughly disappoint my critics, and I intend to do so with all the enthusiasm with which they become accustomed.
Emily, what's your analysis on this?
Yeah, my colleague Sean Davis at the Federalist was talking to folks in Senate conservative circles today and Senate insiders, and their read on the situation actually is that this is a way for Mitch McConnell to hold on to power, kind of paradoxically, because it looked like he actually might have been pushed out sooner than November, or at least that his legacy was going to be severely tarnished. We saw Senator Ted Cruz and actually other sort of mainstream popular conservative senators call for an end to Mitch McConnell's leadership over the course of just the last month, especially over that failed immigration deal that he brokered along with Senator James Lankford and Senator Chuck Schumer, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. So that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And all of these Republicans who had been dissatisfied with Mitch McConnell for more than a decade. I mean, Senator Marco Rubio, a popular Republican senator, today after the McConnell news came out, tweeted an emoji that was sort of it was a silly face emoji. And that immediately conjures the fact that Mitch McConnell endorsed Marco Rubio's primary opponent all the way back in 2009, Charlie Crist, who is now a Democrat. Mitch McConnell actually endorsed Rand Paul's primary opponent back in 2014. He has done this where he has sort of staked out a position against the hardcore conservatives. He spoke out constantly against the Tea Party in the 2010s and really became an enemy of sort of the conservative movement in Washington, D.C., but was able to paper over those divisions by getting a lot of appointments to the Supreme Court and a lot of what people saw, at least for a time, as conservative victories. And so they sort of went along with Mitch McConnell as leader because he was, seen as somebody who was a legislative master. He knew parliamentary procedure. He knew how to obstruct what Democrats were doing. But that started to bubble to the surface just in the last month. So it's very possible that in the coming months, Mitch McConnell would have faced a really, really tough challenge. And now he'll have time. I mean, he clings to power for another election cycle and will have time to kind of handpick a successor, especially because, again, his health is failing. He's had serious health complications just in the last year. And people who work in the Senate say he just physically looks much frailer than he used to. And that's understandable given the health complications.
Another man who is looking much frailer in recent years is the president himself, Joe Biden. And this poll that has come out might come as no surprise. This poll shows that Joe Biden is facing an enthusiasm gap heading into the 2024 election. Emily, are you surprised? Why could that be?
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm not surprised by that at all. But there have been other polls that have found not only is it an enthusiasm gap, some of it is translating into gains for Donald Trump. So, for example, New York Times and Axios both had polls in the last month or so that showed Donald Trump gaining like no Republican, high-profile Republican has in a long time with young voters. So it's, for example, or Black voters and Hispanic voters is what some polls have found. And so it's not just that Democrats are less enthusiastic about Joe Biden. It's actually that some people are starting to take a second look at Donald Trump, which is not what anybody here in Washington, D.C. would have predicted. But that's how bad Joe Biden is for the Democratic Party, especially, again, with young people who are very crucial to his victory in 2020, coming out in big numbers in college towns and swinging the vote for him in battleground states with some of those big college towns. It's one thing to have an enthusiasm gap that's bad enough on its own, but what it looks like is also some of that is translating to Donald Trump. So that's in Michigan, for example, last night, some 20% of the vote was a protest vote. So uncommitted, that option got about 13% of the vote. Another 5 or so went to Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson. We saw that in college towns. We also just saw that in areas that were concentrated with young people. A lot of the upset was over Joe Biden's policy towards Israel. So with young voters in particular, that enthusiasm gap is real. And what's worse for Democrats is it could actually start bleeding into support for Republicans.
And people are now looking at what are the best replacements for Joe Biden. You've written a piece on why Kamala Harris is not a good bet to be Joe Biden's replacement and why we should really prepare for the downfall of Kamala Harris. Can you talk us through why that is?
I went and looked back at some of the polling for Kamala Harris because, I remember 2017, 2018, Kamala Harris was one of the politicians that had the most buzz and the most goodwill with sort of elite media and the political establishment here in Washington, D.C. And it showed in her polls. She was Glamour's Woman of the Year. I think that was back in 2018, was getting tons of positive press coverage. And in the polls, she was doing really well. She was going up and up and up. And then after she became vice president and the spotlight really hit her hard, she had a failed presidential candidacy in the middle of that, too. Everyone, again, thought, Kamala Harris might be the one to beat. She would be a safe bet. If you were putting money on the candidates, you wouldn't be dumb for putting most of your chips on Kamala Harris. But she didn't even make it to Iowa, again, because just this sort of lackluster performance. And when the spotlight really hit her as vice president, she's had gaffe after gaffe after gaffe. Part of that is because the Biden team has given her the worst possible tasks, fixing the, quote, root causes of the border crisis, not an easy thing to deal with at all. So she hasn't been helped by that, but she just says things that go viral for being so just like the perfect stereotype of a politician who's using a lot of words but not saying anything. It's almost a parody of that. And she does it every time she gives a major speech.
Looking at the Republican Party, it looks more and more likely by the day that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. What about Nikki Haley? How much longer can she stay in the race for? She lost the primaries in South Carolina, in Michigan. What's your take or your prediction, I guess, with Nikki Haley?
It's interesting because until actually she just lost in South Carolina, she was getting a lot of money. I mean, she was outspending Trump. She even outspent Ron DeSantis in Iowa, but she outspent Trump and Ron DeSantis in Iowa and New Hampshire, and then massively outspent Trump in South Carolina, especially in the last month. They blew him out of the water because some Democrats and wealthy people that are sort of on both sides of the aisle, give to people on both sides of the aisle, were bankrolling her campaign. They see it as sort of a protest campaign against Donald Trump and not necessarily a viable campaign to actually beat Donald Trump. So the question is whether those donors are willing to keep putting money into Nikki Haley's race to help her kind of limp along. She says she's going to be in this past Super Tuesday. She already bought a 7-figure ad buy ahead of Super Tuesday. She is putting more money into this race, and she does still have some money to put into this race until Super Tuesday. But if she wants to really stick it out, she can. It just depends on whether she's able to fund that money. And personally, it looks like she does have the will to do that. I don't know if she ultimately will, but she has talked about how getting 40% of the vote or getting 30% of the vote, like she did in Michigan last night. She got about 40% in South Carolina, about 40% in New Hampshire. She says that's not a small group of the Republican Party. And so for her to kind of continue making this stand on what she says is a very principled stand, the media really loves it. There could be a lot in it for her down the road if she's able to sort of become the high-profile foil to Donald Trump, almost the heir apparent after Donald Trump to that sort of donor class. So it just depends on if people are willing to fund this sort of public relations campaign against Donald Trump. It's more PR campaign than it is political campaign.
Okay, finally, Emily, an Italian television show has recently mocked Joe Biden in a Saturday Night Live style skit by poking fun at the president's mental fitness. The skit portrayed an actor mimicking Joe Biden, mumbling through a speech, wandering aimlessly, and confusing world leaders' names. Let's take a look.
Buonasera, Presidente Biden. Oh, Presidente Biden. President, Mr. President. It's okay?
Are you okay, President?
Ok, tutto a posto. Welcome, benvenuto. No, di nuovo, mamma mia. President, Mr. President, ecco.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Ok, it's okay.
Yeah, very good. What's your name?
Con chi parla? Mr. President.
My name is Joe Kennedy.
No, Biden, lei è Biden. È Biden. Ma...
Oh, no. Emily, did they get it right? Is it a little bit too close to home?
Again, yeah, I think it resonates with a lot of voters because it keeps showing up in the polls that people think, and it happens to Trump too. I mean, there's a lot of dissatisfaction, and Nikki Haley has talked about this on the campaign trail. There's widespread dissatisfaction with the same candidates as 2020 being what's on the ballot in 2024. There's a lot of polling that suggests people think Joe Biden is too old to be president. There's even polling of Democrats that suggests they wish they had another option. And so much of it, because he's passed a lot of legislation. He has put a lot of executive actions into order, but a lot of it just comes down to his inability to get through some sentences often when he's speaking publicly. He does fall and stumble a lot. And it just reminds me of the George W. Bush era. It reminds me of the Trump era, when constantly Americans felt like they were being embarrassed on the world stage by their president. And a lot of the people that were upset about George W. Bush doing that and really liked Obama for being sort of refreshing and the anti-George W. Bush, someone Americans could feel proud of when he was, at the G20 summit. A lot of them are defending Joe Biden now. And I don't think that's really working for voters, because for voters, when you're not that partisan, you just see a man who's really, really struggling, not unlike Mitch McConnell has really struggled with his health. It's very visible, and it's almost uncomfortable to watch. And I think the Italian sketch actually really nailed that dynamic.
Oh, I think they did too. It is uncomfortable to watch. We keep watching it though. Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist. Thank you so much for coming on the program. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.